How to get a cinematic look without the Hollywood budget. What's happening? It's George VK. Welcome to Filmmaker Secrets. Today we're taking a look at a plugin for DaVinci Resolve called Dehancer that will hopefully help you get closer to that film look. Now stick around because this isn't just another plugin review. I'll be sharing pro secrets on how to craft a cinematic image step by step so you can finally achieve that look you're after. What does cinematic mean anyway? Does anyone really know? Apparently the word cinema comes from the Greek etymology of kinema, which means movement. So by those terms, cinematic has something to do with motion and movement. Even though today we mostly think of it as a stylistic term for film. So let's agree that when we talk about a shot delivering a cinematic experience, we mean it evokes a certain suspension of disbelief that deepens our immersion in the story. Okay, so here we are in DaVinci Resolve. I've opened up a project that we're gonna be just taking a look at for some examples. There's a mix of Blackmagic camera footage, Canon C70 footage, Canon 5D Mark IV footage. There might even be some drone footage in here. We'll see if we get to play around with that. But let's just dive right into our color page within DaVinci Resolve. And let's just pick a fancy Canon C70 shot. This one looks good. Okay, so right here, this may look complicated at first, and if you're familiar at all with Darren Moston on YouTube, he's a pro. He has shared this node tree that you see right here, and I've actually quite grown accustomed to it because it gives you a lot of flexibility, but you can always pick and choose the nodes that you actually want to use. So majority of the time, 80% of this is not used, but I know that when I need certain things and certain adjustments, they're already ready for me in this node tree. This is a fixed node tree, so it's always gonna be the same across all of my shots, meaning that if I ever need to turn a node on or off across multiple shots, then I can just ripple that change within this little menu here. Ripple node changes to selected clips or to the current group. So let's take a look at what we've got cooking here. I'm using a color transform right after a little bit of noise reduction. Then we have a balance and exposure node right here. Then a contrast node, saturation, and then we've got a few of these parallel nodes, one for the sky if I ever need to make adjustments to the sky, temperature, HDR, that's basically if I ever need to pull highlights out of a shot, the warper if I need to adjust any colors, and curves, pretty self-explanatory. Then all of these parallel nodes get mixed into this parallel mixer. Then this trim node is any sort of after the fact adjustments that I want to make, like I need to bring up the shadows, you know, bring up the lift a little bit, or perhaps something to do with the midtones, or maybe a little bit of saturation adjustment. Anything that I need to do after the fact of all of these parallel nodes and all of these primary adjustments. Then I have just 3 presets for power windows. And then down here we have the color transform to go back into Rec 709. So here we're taking the camera input color space into the DaVinci wide gamut intermediate space. So we're utilizing as much of the color space as possible while we're color grading, and then we're taking it back to Rec 709. And then after we transform the color space to Rec 709, we apply the Dehancer node here. So the Dehancer plugin lives in this node. And the reason these 3 are turned off, the Kodak, film emulation, halation, and texture, is because I have actually found that the Dehancer plugin has much better utilization of the halation, of the blooming effect, and the grain. So I don't actually need to use them separately in their own individual nodes anymore. I can just go straight into Dehancer and use them here. Halation, bloom, and film grain. So that's really useful. That effectively takes out these three nodes, and I'm going to restructure my node tree to account for that now. Now this little node here, the Mac LUT, that is simply to compensate for the display that you typically run into an issue with Mac displays, where once you export out of DaVinci Resolve, what you were looking at within the program when you were color grading looks much different than when it's actually just exported and you're looking at it on the screen. So this little LUT adjustment is simply it's from Cullen Kelly from YouTube, and it's just a LUT that just has a little bit of an adjustment, and you can search for this Mac OS Viewing Transform, CKC, that's Cullen Kelly. And before I do the export, I'm actually going to turn that off so it doesn't affect the export. This is simply for viewing it within DaVinci Resolve, okay? So that's just, let's get that out of the way. So while we're color grading, we're going to keep that Mac LUT on. We've got the basic node tree structure, and we know that we need to do all our color correction, all of our balancing, all of our exposure adjustments, contrast, saturation, any sort of power windows that we're going to do before we get into Dehancer. Okay, we got to start with a really good image, and that really does start in the cinematography phase, right? We got to capture a really good image in camera before we bring it in and enhance it with color correction, enhance it yet again with our color grade, and then one final time enhance it with Dehancer to apply that film emulation, that film look, to really finalize our cinematic image. So let's go ahead and jump into Dehancer. Right here, right off the bat, we have our input settings, but because I'm using the color space transform nodes, I'm basically just taking the Rec 709 conversion and applying the Dehancer plugin after that. But you can always change the source and all the different camera settings here if you were just to use the Dehancer without the color space transform. So it does have that functionality. Then we have some exposure compensation, basically to get a better starting image if you have any sort of adjustments in that sense, to compensate for any technical mistakes. Temperature, tint, defringing, and the defringe radius. And then you would enable that here. That's one thing I've noticed with Dehancer. You have to remember to enable to check these boxes. Otherwise, all of your adjustments within each of these categories are not going to be applied until you actually hit enable. Okay, and that's just one way to preview what the changes are. So for example, I have this film emulation selected of Kodak Ultramax 400, which I've been enjoying very much. If you twirl it down, there's quite a few film stocks that you can choose from, right? And this is the beauty of Dehancer. This is where a lot of the power is. You're telling Dehancer what should DaVinci Resolve make this footage look as if it was shot on a particular stock, right? On a particular film stock. So we've got Kodak Porta, all the different ones here with 400, ISO, 800. We've got the Ultramax, we've got the Vision 350D, which is a popular choice, even just for simple color correction and color grading. We've got some Fujifilm. So play around with all the different looks and what you can get. It's really fun to just kind of see and start getting nostalgic if you've ever shot on film, or even those disposable cameras where you then take them in to get them developed and get the photos printed back. There's some really fun ones with the Lomochrome that give you some really wild effects, but I tend to stick with just a few, like the Ultramax, the Vision 350D, and some of the Fujifilm ones. But this one here, if we hit enabled, you can see what it's doing. So right there, that's with it, and that's without it. And obviously we have to start with a good image. So right here, we have a sunset shot. It's already nice and warm and beautiful. We've done some basic adjustments in our primaries to balance the shot. Most times to get the exposure correct, I will start off into the HDR primaries, page and just adjust the exposure here, but I actually like where it's at on this shot. So I basically just did a few simple adjustments in my primaries, and then we've got a little bit of a contrast with the pivot turned down slightly, and then just a little bit of saturation, actually quite a lot, 65. So it's boosted up. Then I'm turning down the highlights, so -37 on this parallel node, and that is pretty much it. Then we're taking the color space transform from DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate Input Gamma to Rec 709, and this Mac LUT requires for the color space transform to be Gamma 2.2. Within our Dehancer, we've got this film where you can select your film stock. Then we have our film developer. So if you were to actually emulate developing the film, these are the different adjustments that you can make here digitally, whereas in the olden days, it was through different chemicals and different processes. So we've got contrast boost. So if we go ahead and enable that, remember you got to enable, we can boost the contrast. And this is emulating the actual development of film, right? So the process you would do, I'm not sure what it is exactly, but the process you would go through in order to increase, to boost the contrast. And you can reset by clicking this button here. Then gamma correction is going to be taken into account any sort of midtones, color separation, and color boost. Now, I tend to leave the film developer off because I'm still learning Dehancer. Then we've got film compression. This is where we've got the impact is basically how much of an effect you want this to have. The white point, you're selecting the threshold of where it's at. So if you can see what that's doing to the sun, is you're basically telling Dehancer where that white point should be, and it's using this slider to compensate for it. So if we wanted to ease off of that sun, we would increase the white point, telling Dehancer actually the white point is at 120. So we can see it's softened up that sun. But if we really wanted to punch it up and make it a really hot sun, we would turn the white point down, meaning it would compensate the other way. Then the tonal range, same thing, right? You can see what it's doing there, really kind of boosting up the tones. Then the color density is basically how much of that color we want to show through. Now this is another one that I tend to leave off because this is really getting into that customization. This is where Dehancer really shines because it shows you how flexible it is and how powerful it is to actually manipulate the image, much like you would be able to do back in the day when you're developing film. Right here we've got expand. This works similarly with telling Dehancer where the black point, where the white point is, and you can change the color mode from normal to luma and get that enabled or disabled. So let's say that our sun is a little bit too bright. We can always tell that the white point is a little bit higher, and then we just take that down slightly. Right here is where we tell Dehancer what print to actually use. So there would be the film stock that you shoot on, and then the print that you actually print the video, the film, right? The footage that you captured onto in order to get projected for viewing. I tend to like the Kodak 2383. It's classic print film. You can do Fujifilm. Cinyan film log is basically if you wanted to then take it and use your own film emulation. Like I have this compound clip here, or compound node. Then we've got, let's bring it back to 2383. We've got our target white, our exposure, then our tonal contrast, which I like to play with to get it just right, just enough of a contrast where the colors are nice and punchy, it's nice and saturated, and I get it to a point where I really like that look. And then the color density, start low and then start to bring it up until you see to where you like it, okay? And then saturation, it's pretty self-explanatory. Default is gonna be at 100, okay? So that's the print section. Now the color head section is very interesting. This is where back in the olden times, they would manipulate the colors depending on how much of whatever chemical you were using. So if you check this gang checkbox, it'll combine these three sliders and you'll be able to move all three at the same time and manipulate the image. Remember, we gotta enable this section. That's my mistake right there. So we can play with the yellow versus blue, magenta versus green, cyan versus red. This is our color theory, RGB, CMY at play here. So we can really play with some fun effects. So let's reset all of these three sliders. And let's say we want to get into that sort of teal and orange look that's so popular with film emulation and the cinematic look, right? All the orange and teal LUTs that you see floating around that people just slap on their footage and expect it to look good. Well, you got to start first with a cinematic image, right? A really well shot piece of footage, and then you can start to play with some of these things. So let's say we want a little bit more of that yellow, and now we want to bring in some cyan. So take a look at what's happening. Very subtle, so you don't want to go overboard because it starts looking wonky, especially with an image like this where it's so warm and yellow. So there's that. We can play with the tones separated out into shadows, midtones, and highlights. So if we wanted the shadows to be a little bit cooler or warmer, if we wanted the midtones to be a little bit warmer or cooler, this is where you get to really play with the customization, right? And we can enable and disable that. That's before and that's after. So it brings in a little bit of that filmic tone. And then this impact, again, slider is telling you how much of the effect you want to be applied. So it's usually a good idea to back it off and then see how much of the effect you actually want, right? Okay, so we'll disable that for now. Now we're getting into some of the juicy stuff with film grain, okay? We zoom in and I enable that and disable. You can see how much texture it's actually putting on there. It makes everything looks so palpable and so delicious because the grain, what's so interesting about grain is it doesn't just apply an animation of grain across the whole image. It just makes everything cohesive. All the colors start to come together. All the tonalities, all the shifts between highlights into shadows start to smooth out. It just gives the whole image such a I mean, well, that's the only way I can really say it. It feels like you can actually touch the image, right? It gives it that sort of realness factor. And so we can select different profiles. If you go obviously to 16 millimeter, it's going to be a lot more grainy. I tend to like something in between the 35 millimeter. And if it's looking too grainy, you can always turn it down, or what I like to do is actually go up to 65 millimeter, and that usually gives me what I want because it's a much more subtle film grain, but it's still there and it still has that effect of bringing everything together. Now, halation. This is a popular topic. Let's see what it's actually doing in our image. So take a look at those highlights, especially right here, right here. See what it's doing? The halation is actually an artifact from film stock. Whenever a highlight is recorded onto film stock, the emulsion on the film stock starts to bleed into the darker area. So whenever you have a really bright highlight touching a darker area, that bright highlight, because of the concentration of light that's hitting that emulsion, it actually bleeds into a part of the shadow. So you can see right there, it's giving that little glow around the highlighted areas. And I found that the Dehancer halation effect is so much better and so much cleaner, and it just makes so much more sense than the halation plugin within DaVinci Resolve, or even the halation setting within the film look creator, which is new, I believe, in DaVinci Resolve 19. So version 19 introduced the film look creator, which is great, right? And I definitely played around with it, but the Dehancer halation looks Just so delicious, so good. I'm gonna press Z to zoom out to bring up to the fit view. And let's move on to the bloom. Right here, you can see if we go and really turn it up, the amplify, you can see what it's doing, right? It's more of a global effect. The bloom is taking wherever those highlighted areas are and really kind of spreading them out and making them wrap around different objects. So whereas halation is a lot more localized, it's really where those points of contrast between highlight and shadow are. It's basically if you were to screw on a Pro Mist filter on the end of your lens, and it takes those highlights and blooms them and really softens them out to give you that film look. This is what it's doing in terms of emulating that in post-production, right? So we really amplified this bloom effect to show you, but usually you want to keep it lower. And again, the trick that I learned from a photographer, Scott Kelly, is start your adjustment all the way at 0. And then slowly start to bring it back up. And while you're doing that, you're watching the image and you're seeing what it's doing, okay? And then it's a good idea to turn it off and on to see exactly what it's doing. Because your eyes start to adjust and adapt to the image and to all the effects that you're doing, there is such a thing as color grading fatigue, right? Because you stare at the same frame of the same image for sometimes hours at a time, making small little adjustments, perfecting it, right? You got to give your eyes a little bit of a rest, and you got to allow for your eyes to see that image in a new light, in a new way. And so this is a little trick that I learned where you can start low and start to bring it back up slowly, okay? So if we enable that, we can see that bloom effect. Now let's move on to film damage. If we enable that, I've found this to be a very subtle effect, but it does give us some nice little imperfections within the image, right? Things that you would see on actual film stock with scratches and little dots and little kind of imperfections that naturally would happen because it's a physical medium, right? It's almost like dead pixels in the digital realm, but here it's actual physical damage to the film. And this effect is basically replicating that. And again, we have some options for 8mm. You can see there's like little hairs that show up and they would actually get animated. So it gives us that nice nostalgic feel. And let's turn off our noise reduction just so we have a bit of a better performance on the playback. And you can see what it's doing. If we full screen that, that's nice. You can almost hear the sound, right, of that, the scratchy sound of kind of like a record player, right? This is bringing me back to the olden days. Not that I'm that old, and I actually did shoot with 16mm film at one point. Film breath is going to give you a little bit of that imperfection in terms of the light. So as the light is being shown through the projection, as the film is being projected, there's going to be a little bit of that breath. And it's a very subtle effect. And you can obviously turn it up by going to something like 8mm. It's very hard to really show it, especially with YouTube compression, but it gives it that little bit of a breath. Then we have gate weave, and this is emulating the fact that when film is going through the projector, it's not going to be perfect in terms of placement. Okay, so the rivets are not always going to be perfect, and you're going to have a little bit of a shift, a little bit of a jiggle within your film. So you see, as I enable that, it scales the image slightly because it's going to compensate for that movement, so it has to scale the image up slightly. And let's make that full screen to preview it better. You can see it's just a little bit of a jiggle, a little bit of movement to, again, emulate that film projection, okay? Now, overscan is a little bit of a gimmick. It's almost like an effect that you would use for a small part of a frame to give it that nostalgic feel, but if we enable that, we automatically see we get this sort of film strip effect, and we have some different presets, Super 8, 16 millimeter, super 16. We've got super 35, which is actually pretty nice. Widescreen 35, and this ultra panavision, which is that super, widescreen format. And then we got the shape of the actual gate. So that the gate is basically this, right? The gate that the light is shining through to project the film. So we've got a neat sharp corners, neat normal, and then neat rounded, which is what the trend that you've been seeing on Instagram with rounded corners in those frames that are sort of nostalgic. And then we've got the perforation mode of negative or positive, film orientation vertical or horizontal. So if we were to do, let's say super 16, we've got sort of that horizontal effect. And then some basic adjustments for exposure, scale, lens zoom, offset, the X and the Y, depending on what you're going for. And then the gate defocus is actually nice. So if we bring it to neat rounded and back to vertical, if you watch the gate and then we take it to ultra panavision, you can see the edges of that gate start to defocus as it would in real life when you're projecting this through a projector, where the actual edge would be out of focus in order for the film to be in focus. Then finally we come to the vignette, which I tend to not use as much. So if we disable the overscan effect, if I ever apply a vignette, it's going to be in one of these nodes individually. But here you have the option to apply a vignette, the size, the feather, and the aspect ratio. The feather is how much of softening is going to be applied to that vignette. The size is basically kind of like the spread in Lightroom. And then exposure is how much of that either bright or darkening of the edges that you're going to have. And aspect ratio is the shape of that vignette, depending on what you're going for. And then if you hit mask mode, you can see exactly what you're working with to get it just right. And then hit mask mode to bring it back to the actual vignette view, okay? The output, this is where you're gonna dial in, okay? So if you want less of that film look overall with all of the different adjustments within Dehancer, you would turn it down. I usually don't mess with this because I will make any sort of individual adjustments throughout all the different categories, okay? And then finally, right here is the quality. Now, Dehancer is a heavy plugin, okay? So if you're working on a laptop like I am, even if it is a beefy laptop, it's gonna slow things down. So make sure that you're working with proxies, make sure that your machine can actually pull this effect. And at as a very last step, you can change this quality from normal fast to high, but I haven't actually noticed a great change between this quality setting. I usually just keep it on normal fast and I'm very satisfied. So let's take a look at some of these other examples. For example, this shot here, if we go into our Dehancer and turn it off, this was the color corrected image. This is, if I completely bypass color grading, this was out of my Blackmagic cinema camera 6K full frame, shot with a 50 millimeter t2.9 anamorphic lens with a adapter. So the lens itself is a 1.6x squeeze factor, but the adapter is a 1.25x addition. So you can screw that onto any spherical lens and it'll turn it into an anamorphic lens. In this instance, combining the already anamorphic lens from Suri with the adapter, it turned it into what you would call a true anamorphic experience with a 2.4 to 1 ratio that we have here. And this is the image straight out of camera. I did a basic color correction, color grade with my usual node tree here. And then if we apply the Dehancer plugin, it just makes all of the colors so rich and so nostalgic and so delicious. Let's take a look in full screen. You can see the grain is nicely playing with those highlights. The sky is looking really nice. That gradation is really beautiful. So here it is without, and here is with Dehancer. You can see it just starts to look like it was actually shot on film. Let's take a look at another shot here. This was shot in the mountains close to my hometown in Almaty, Kazakhstan. And it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous area. And right here, if we turn Dehancer off and on, you can see what it's doing to the skin tones, to the background. I mean, it just brings everything together. Like, this is already a pretty nice image, right? Perhaps the skin tone is a little bit red and I would, compensate for that. But I actually don't need to, because as soon as I apply Dehancer, it just makes it look like it was shot on film. And it goes to show you, like, go figure, right? The plugin that is meant to emulate film is actually doing that really well. Right here, this is my son and my wife. We've got a Dehancer plugin applied. That's without it, and that's with it. Now here is a piece of footage from a Canon 5D Mark IV. No log profile. Colors are baked in. Here it is without Dehancer. Here is without color corrections. Let's go through it. Okay, full screen. This is the image straight out of camera. So you can see it's not log, because I don't have log on my Canon 5D Mark IV. If we do just a simple adjustment, okay, so I've got some balance, I've got some exposure adjustments. I'm applying a little bit of contrast, a little bit of saturation, some curves, but it's a very baseline correction, okay? I'm just looking to get it to a nice place to where I can actually work with it within Dehancer. And we apply Dehancer, and it just brings it into this filmic look. It looks cinematic. The colors are nice and rich. The background is thrown into the background. The foreground is brought into the front. That's without it, and that's with it. The skin tones are looking much better. I mean, this does half of the work for me. Okay, right here, another example. So here, I actually started this shot with the film look corrector, or the film look creator, right? So this is within DaVinci Resolve 19, this new plugin, Film Look Creator, and it's got similar things where, it's emulating the film look, but it just doesn't do as good of a job as Dehancer. At least you would probably have to spend quite a bit of time messing with the Film Look Creator in order to try and get close to what Dehancer does with just a few clicks, right? I just have to select the film stock, the film print, make a few different adjustments. One thing that I forgot to show you right here, this push-pull slider. I can't believe I forgot this. So once you actually select your profile for the film stock, you can start to push and pull, and this is basically what you would do, as I understand it, within your film development. So when you're pushing and pulling the different chemicals, so you can see what it's doing to the image very subtly, right? But like those greens are going a little bit warmer or cooler. So it's just another way to really control how much or how little of that profile effect is affecting the image. So this is the very first step that I do when I apply the Dehancer look, or the Dehancer plugin to my footage that I've already color corrected. I play with this push and pull slider to see the actual look that I want to go for. Whatever this slider is doing, I'm not explaining it correctly, but it's magic. Just know that it's magic. Okay, so here it is without Dehancer. Here it is straight out of camera. Let's apply a quick little color correction. The colors are vibrant, but they're almost a little bit neon, right? It's a little bit too green. The background is just so lush. There's so much focus going on to the background. I want to look at the dog. So let's apply the Dehancer plugin, and it just pulls everything together. The subject is in focus. The eye wants to go towards that contrasty image. I mean, I can play around with power windows, right? I can bring in a power window to this dog. And one quick little tip, if you're working on a machine that's not so powerful, you can always go Shift D to bypass any color grades, any fusion effects, so that when you're tracking within the tracking window and you hit the double arrow button to track backward and forward, it's going to do it much quicker because it's not having to process the color grade and any effects that you have applied. It's simply doing the track onto your log image, and then you can always turn it back on. Okay, so let's increase the size of this power window, and we'll just go to our primary and turn up the gamma slightly. I don't like to go overboard because then you can start to actually notice that adjustment. So we'll turn off the power window so we can see what we're working with. Command D to audition our new power window, and that's it right there. Dehancer. What a change, right? Let's choose another shot right here, another Canon 5D Mark IV shot. It's my beautiful wife, Barbara. This one I was actually very impressed with because this is what we started with, right? And then if we just do a simple color correction and bring Dehancer in, now that is a very big shift from what we started with. Okay, full screen, straight out of camera, straight out of the Canon 5D Mark IV, shot with a 35mm 1.4 Canon lens, Sigma lens. We bring in some color correction, balance, exposure, saturation, contrast, all that good stuff, a little bit of curves, and Dehancer just makes it boom. It makes it go wild. I mean, look at that. Look at this handsome guy. Look at this handsome guy. So another example, straight out of camera. Bland, boring, that's fine. Even though we're shooting with colors baked in, we gotta get some pop out of this image. So we do a basic color grade, and then we apply the Dehancer plugin, and it looks delicious. Let's see what else we've got. Right here, another Canon 5D Mark IV footage. It's all right. It's a little flat. Let's apply our basic color grade. Okay, looking much better. Not bad. A lot of contrast, a lot of pop. I've got some power windows on the eye to really bring it out. Okay, and a very specific one for the actual iris. So if you can see how that's without it, that's with it. Some sharpening, some saturation, some color correction there. And then we bring in Dehancer, okay? And what that's doing is basically applying that film profile, the Ultramax 400. I don't even have the print on here, so we can always go the Kodak 2383, but I actually have it right here in my compound node. Now let me just show you what this compound node is doing. The compound node is taking that color space transform that we took from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate into Rec 709 and Gamma 2.2 into Rec 709 Cineon Film Log, because this Kodak 2383 film look requires the color space to be such. The output gamma needs to be Cineon Film Log in order to take this LUT. So if you've ever applied this film look LUT and your footage looks weird and you're like, I don't understand, I'm supposed to have a film look. This category says film looks, and I apply it and it looks weird. That's why your color space, the output gamma, needs to be in that Cineon Film Log. And those are the two nodes that are doing this, this conversion. And so if we take that off and use Dehancer, we may have to make some adjustments just because this is right now in just the regular linear profile. But if we use the actual Dehancer 2383 Kodak print film, you can see we've got a much darker image, so we would likely need to play around with the exposure. We may need to go into our primaries, our balance and exposure. So we've got the exposure turned down here. May need to bring that back up. Maybe the contrast is a little bit too much, so we'll turn that down. Because Dehancer with this print profile is actually doing quite a lot. We can actually go in here and adjust the exposure this way, bring in some more tonal contrast to get those delicious colors back, maybe give a little bit more of that color density to bring the skin tone back to where it was, and boom, we've got a beautiful, beautiful shot. So that's without Dehancer. It's all right. It's color corrected. It's more or less color graded, but that's with Dehancer. It's just so rich. It's so deep within the colors, within the tonality, within the roll off of highlights into midtones, into shadows. I can't say enough good stuff about this. I mean, I am basically permanently embedding Dehancer into my workflow. Right here, we've got an interview setup. I mean, gorgeous. Let's take a look. So that's straight out of camera, right? No color correction. It's a good interview setup. We've got a nice key light that's got a very soft roll off. It's on the far side of the camera, so we've got a short lighting interview setup. Short lighting meaning that we're putting the key on the short side of the face because our subject is looking camera left. We've got the key coming from this side, and then it's just this gorgeous backdrop with this location here with all of these chandeliers. And so that's with color correction. Nice, we've got deeper tones, we've got some contrast, our balance is dialed in, but let's bring in Dehancer. Boom! I mean, that just looks good. And we don't even have the print profile. We can always go in and use the print profile here, but I've got a similar setup with this compound node for the Kodak 2383 film look. Well, guess what? Dehancer also has an app. So right here, we can select any sort of photos that we've allowed it to have access to. And we have a myriad of presets to choose from. I quite like, that's a bunch of puppies. Makes it kind of difficult to film and get good audio because they're constantly squealing and asking for their mom's attention and to suck on the teat. And she keeps running away. Well, we'll do what we can. And right here, we've got some Kodak Vision 3, much like in the actual Dehancer plugin in DaVinci Resolve. Let's check out my favorite Vision 3, the Ultramax 400. That looks cool. That looks nice and rich. Let's maybe play around with some of these Fujifilm Instax 2383. We've got the print Industrial 400 plus the Kodak Endura. So this is actually taking into account the film stock and the actual film print. So if we hold down the image, we can see the before and after. Let's check out another preset like this Fuji Reala 500D plus the 2383 film. That's got some nice cool tones, nice little texture on the grain. And you can see what it's doing to the buildings here. It's got that halation effect very similar to the one inside of the DaVinci Resolve Dehancer plugin that we were just taking a look at. And then you can always go in, they're right there squealing, and they're so cute, but they make a lot of noise. Makes it difficult to film, you know what I mean? We can go into the actual edit section and make any fine-tune adjustments to the exposure, the tonal contrast, saturation, color density, the target white. This is all very similar to what we were just taking a look at inside of the Dehancer plugin in DaVinci Resolve. We can go back out to our photos. Let's take a look at a screenshot from the short film Ritual that I shot on the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K, the full frame model. And let's check out some of the presets we've got going here. Ooh, the Astrum color, negative 125. That's before, and that's after. We can take a look at Ooh, these are interesting. They've got like a nice little old-timey kind of look. Hey, little guy, what you doing here? Come here. This is what is making all the noise right here. Yeah? You're making a lot of noise? You're making a lot of noise? Okay, go. And we can, let's see, maybe some of the Lomochrome ones will be interesting to use on this. Ooh, that's before, that's after. Let's take a look at this one. That's a lot of grain. This Vision 350D plus the Kodak Endura. That's before and that's after. We can go in and adjust the exposure if we want to. Bump up the tonal contrast for more of that pop. Give a little bit less saturation, more color density. I mean, this is a very versatile, and then we can always just go ahead and share it, save to the gallery, or go into the share menu as we please. Let's take a look at another example of this little doe right here. Ooh, I quite like this Astrum Color Negative 125. That's before, that's after. This has nice tones too, right here. The Fuji Eterna Vivid 500. That's before, that's after. Fujichrome Velvia 50. Now this looks super antique. Look at that, before and after. Now, of course, we want to start with a good image. Ooh, who's this handsome fella? Ooh, yeah, that's looking nice. Let's maybe try one of these Fujifilm Instax 2383. That's before and that's after. I quite like this Kodak Ektar 25 plus the Kodak Endura paper print. You can see the halation there if we zoom in where the highlight is falling on my arm, my huge biceps. That's before and that's after. You can also see the highlight in the hair there. That's before and that's after. That's looking nice. This Kodak Vision 3 200T, and I quite actually like the 50D plus the 2383. That's before and that's after. I like those cool tones. We're in the mountains, so it makes sense. Now, if we check out, this is the Dehancer team presets. We can also create our own presets from our edits, from the original. We can import presets that we download or sort by all presets that are present. And we can always save the preset by clicking the button on the bottom left. Oh, and then we can preview a quick little histogram by clicking the button at the top left. And we have the undo and redo buttons at the top right. And then right here is to go back out to the gallery. Let's take a look at this simple iPhone shot. Ooh, Konica Minolta VX400 Super. That's before, that's after. Let's maybe try this Rolei CN200 plus the Kodak Endura. That's before, that's after. Those are really cool tones. And that's the Dehancer app for your smartphone.